Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How does the concept of responsibility to protect, commonly called R2P, help to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity? My guest today is involved in studying these issues and heads up a very important center. My guest today is Dr. Simon Adams. Dr. Adams is the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Between 1994 and 2002, Dr. Adams worked with Sinn Féin and former IRA prisoners in support of the Northern Ireland peace process. He's also a former anti-apartheid activist and a member of the African National Congress. Dr. Simon Adams, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill, and I'm impressed that you got that whole title out without stumbling over. It's a very long organization.
It is a tongue twister.
It is
It certainly is. Well, let's get right into it. We're going to get into your center in just a moment. Let's talk about R2P, responsibility to protect. Where did this concept come from? Is it well defined? What exactly are we talking about with the responsibility to protect?
Yeah, I think to really understand R2P, I think you have to kind of go back to Rwanda and the genocide in 1994, and then at Srebrenica, of course, the genocide in the following year in July of 1995. And I think it was after those obviously huge tragedies and the shock of the failure, of international failure in both those examples, that there was a kind of recognition among senior members of the UN, and I think more generally by Kofi Annan among others, that, you know, even though we kind of all pledged never again at the end of the Second World War, the history of the second half of the 20th century was really again and again and again. So how to kind of shift the whole momentum and really make a, if for want of a better expression, an equilibrium shift in the way that the world responded to these most shocking crimes. And I think R2P is a product of that. It was a way of saying we can't fix everything in the world, but surely we can stop these crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing and war crimes from happening. And so the responsibility to protect is really about that.
Mm-hmm. Those are very important terms that you just mentioned, and we read about them quite often. Can you give a one-sentence definition of each? Sometimes
Sure.
we have, maybe I'm the only one who has a tendency to run some of them together.
Yeah, I can try.
Okay.
I mean, I think these are all crimes that are legally defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And I think if people are out there who really want to get into the nuts and bolts, that's where they can go. I mean, we use the blanket term of mass atrocity crimes to describe them: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. But they are legally defined. I think the other thing is that sometimes we try to avoid getting into the nuts and bolts on it because we can see that atrocities are happening, but what exactly kind of atrocity, whether it constitutes crimes against humanity or a crime or war crimes or ethnic cleansing, we leave that to a court of law to determine.
Exactly. There's a whole field of study on
Absolutely.
that. Exactly. Now, you're the director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. What exactly is that, and what do you do? Well, not you, but the center does.
Justify my existence is what you're really saying.
That's right.
So we were set up in 2008, and we were set up by some of the key personalities who were involved in the development of R2P. Gareth Evans, Australia's former foreign minister, who was the person who actually came up with the concept and worked on the international commission that developed this idea. Kofi Annan, Romeo Dallaire, the force commander during the Rwandan genocide, Mary Robinson, the former Irish president, and a lot of other people who were involved in kind of the development of these ideas. And the idea was that, you know, you needed a specialized center to work with the UN, to work with the UN Security Council in particular, but also with the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and to be specifically focused on these issues. So we had a lot of big supporters, our friends at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and Crisis Group, and a lot of government supporters as well. But we're a very small NGO, very focused on those particular issues.
Mm-hmm. And our viewers can go to your website at globalr2p.org to learn more about what you're doing. Well, let's focus on some of those hot spots, some of the really tragic areas of the world, and talk about what you're doing there, what UN agencies are doing there, what the International Criminal Court or whoever's involved, peacekeepers, or whatever the situation might be. We read so much about Syria and the tragedy of Syria. Now it's going on 5 years or 5 years plus or something like that. What is the situation right now? I know it can change within 5 minutes or a day from now, but what is the situation there as far as the situation with genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity? What are you doing?
Sure. I mean, I think Syria is probably the greatest international tragedy of our times and the greatest failure of the UN Security Council, certainly since Rwanda or Srebrenica, in my opinion. You know, when I look at something like Aleppo, we just had Aleppo happen not so long ago. You know, everyone that I know who once lived in Aleppo is now either dead, missing, or a refugee. And that's a very sobering thing when you go to do a TV interview, as I was after Aleppo fell, and realize that there was no longer anybody in that city that I could contact. So it's been a massive and historic failure by the UN Security Council to live up to its responsibilities to the people of Syria and under the UN Charter. I think it is a very volatile situation. It's a constantly evolving situation, but there's no doubt that over the last almost 6 years, crimes against humanity and war crimes have been committed extensively by all parties to the Syrian conflict. But we should never forget that the Syrian government has been responsible for about 90% of civilian casualties, simply because it has better resources to kill and to carry out a war on its own people with. So we're working with the Security Council, but also we've been involved more recently, for example, with states like Liechtenstein, who were involved in a very interesting political maneuver in the UN General Assembly to establish an investigative mechanism to investigate atrocities in Syria, because if the Security Council can't or won't do its job, then the UN General Assembly should do it.
Now, I would imagine you deal more so with the Security Council, but still, when you're talking about the loggerhead that existed in the Security Council,
Sure.
whereas the U.S. on one side, the Russians, and maybe the Chinese on the other, and couldn't come to an agreement, but still a large part of the UN system, the other 80% of the UN system, the World Food Program, the UN High Commission for Refugees, High Commission for Human Rights, the UN Children's Fund, they were on the ground in Syria helping to provide basic life-saving services to literally millions of Syrians. Do you deal with those, or are you more concerned with the Security Council? I mean, I know you're concerned about what they're doing, but do you have interaction with those other agencies, the humanitarian agencies?
I mean, we would consider them to be colleagues and friends, and so in that sense, like everybody, I was especially dismayed, doesn't even come close, revolted and outraged by, for example, attacks on humanitarian workers, including UN humanitarian workers in Syria, bombed from the air, of course. And other, of course, humanitarian workers have been killed over the last 6 years of the conflict. We certainly stay in contact with those organizations here in New York and also in Geneva, where we have an office as well, a small office. We interact with humanitarian organizations, but on a day-to-day level, we're very focused on monitoring the situation and trying to develop political approaches which will actually hold perpetrators accountable in Syria, rather than this current culture of impunity that has allowed atrocities to just get worse and worse on all sides.
Now, you mentioned Kofi Annan, who was the 7th Secretary General of the UN. Ban Ki-moon from South Korea was the 8th, and now Antonio Guterres is the 9th Secretary General of the UN. And we mentioned a moment ago the UN High Commission for Refugees. He headed up that agency, a very vital agency, for about 10 years, I believe, something like that. What role do you think he will be playing now as Secretary General of the United Nations to focus on not only Syria, but South Sudan, Central African Republic, and many other areas?
I mean, I'm a great fan. I mean, and I think a lot of us, NGO people, humanitarian workers, UN staff, governments, everybody, I think the world really wants to see him succeed in the job, and the 7 billion people really hope that this guy is the guy for the job. I believe that he is. In my discussions with him, something that I've always tried to emphasize is that I think there's no other issue that has tarnished the reputation of the UN as badly as the failure to stop mass atrocities happening in the world. I mean, if you look at the biggest failures that most people would say of the UN, it is Rwanda, it is Srebrenica, it is these other situations where it failed to stop atrocities from happening. Aleppo being the most horrible chapter in that ongoing situation. So I think you can't have sustainable development in the world. You can't address all these issues like climate change or anything else if you can't create a stable environment where mass atrocities are not happening. That's true of Syria. That's also true of South Sudan. That's also true of Nigeria, Burundi, and a whole range of other countries as well. So I certainly, in the occasions when I've had the opportunity to sit with him, which is not every week, but I have had a few chances, that's the message certainly that I've been articulating to him, and I hope that he's going to be a great champion of really putting human rights up front of the UN.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the challenges to the UN peacekeepers. You brought up UN peacekeepers, and of course we do remember '94 in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis, and how the UN, I remember Boutros Ghali, who was Secretary General at that time, went around with a tin cup begging for money and begging for troops, because the UN does not have a standing army. They have to get donor countries to lend troops to the United Nations to go into these areas, and he could not get the United States and France on board primarily, but some other countries too wouldn't come on board to do it, and we saw what happened. But as I think about it over the years, I think the UN's been involved in 70 plus peacekeeping operations, the majority of which have gone fairly well. I mean, they've been successful to a large degree, but some have not, and they've been failures, and those are the ones that you want to really learn your lessons from, I guess. Speaking of another spot that not too many years ago was really heralded as just a wonderful opportunity for the people of South Sudan. They come online, they basically became independent from Sudan, and now we see that as one of the most problematic areas of the world. What can be done in that area? What are the UN peacekeepers doing in that area? What is the Security Council doing? The International Criminal Court, the other key players to try to help improve the situation?
Well, let me just start by saying something about peacekeeping, because I think you touched on something which is really important that people, I think, forget. I mean, if I had my way, this would be a newspaper story in every newspaper in the world. But, you know, I think it's often forgotten the successes as well as the failures of UN peacekeeping. I mean, to many people in the world today living in the most dangerous and deadly conflicts, the UN can still mean the difference between life and death. And I think we see that especially when it comes to UN peacekeeping. And at the moment, 10 out of 16 UN peacekeeping missions, 90% of the 100,000 plus peacekeepers are in situations where either mass atrocities are happening or are threatened, and are protecting civilians in those environments. That's something we should never forget. With regards to South Sudan, where there is, of course, a major peacekeeping mission, it hasn't been a good story. I mean, I think we now have a situation where warlords of both sides, you know, vying for control of their country, have really squandered the good hope and the opportunity that existed after 2011 for the country to become a real prosperous, independent nation. And I think the tragedy of the last, say, couple of years in particular has been, even though we've had a peacekeeping operation there, it hasn't stemmed all of the violence. I think it stemmed some of it. It could be a lot worse if they weren't there. But a lot more needs to be done, and that's why we, for example, support this, the Regional Protection Force, which should be established there. But I think also very, very importantly, I just want to underline this point, we support accountability for perpetrators regardless of their government position or whether they're on the rebel side, regardless of what side, ethnicity, or political affiliation they are. And I think that's been the big missing gap in South Sudan. We have to break that culture of impunity that exists there.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you are involved with a PBS station, a community access television station, an educational institution that has an intra-campus hookup, or if you just have a website and you have an interest in our programs, please feel free to download them and to share them with your friends, family, the general community, and the entire world. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service. Today we're taking a look at what can be done to try to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities. And my guest heads up a center, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and is an expert in this area. My guest is Dr. Simon Adams, who is the executive director of that center that I just mentioned. We were talking about South Sudan. There are many, we could go around the world, or certain areas of the world, and keep hopscotching, but another one that so often falls off the radar screen is Yemen. What is the situation there, and what can be done, again, by the key players that I mentioned a minute ago to try to improve that situation for the majority of the people living in some very desperate conditions?
Yeah, Yemen is probably the most underreported major conflict in the world today. I think if you stopped anybody on the streets of any major city in the world, they would have heard something about the war in Syria and have some basic idea of the conflict. That is absolutely not true of the situation in Yemen. There's a massive humanitarian catastrophe, and as unfortunately, like so many situations in the world today, that's not caused by natural circumstances. This is a man-made catastrophe that's happening in Yemen. So I think the atrocities have been going on both sides of that conflict. We've certainly been working with the Security Council, with others, to encourage that states need to stop selling weapons, of course, to perpetrators in that part of the world, particularly states that are supporters of the Arms Trade Treaty. And of course, I think there's been a huge and growing pressure on the international community to put more pressure on perpetrators, but also parties to the conflict on both sides to negotiate a solution.
Mm-hmm. And another area too that we read about a little more, I guess, and it's been going on for a lot longer, is the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the largest countries in Africa, huge, just immense wealth of natural resources, that type of thing, but it's just been a very troubled area since really back in the early 60s, I guess it was, long before today and long before the events of today. What is the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what is the status of, or what can be done to improve the conditions there?
Yeah, I think Congo is contradictory, because I think it is a massive country, and I think I agree with what you just said. I think particularly since '97, there's been kind of terrible conflict. There's a huge problem, particularly in the east of the country, with armed groups preying upon civilian populations, and then various countries getting involved in those conflicts on one side or another. I think we really had made some progress in Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, over the last couple of years. For example, the campaign against the M23 movement and the campaign against the FDLR, the former Genocide from Rwanda, who took sanctuary in Congo, in attacking those groups and breaking them down and trying to hold people accountable. I think the current crisis is of a different type. It's a political crisis caused by the unwillingness of President Kabila to step down from power. There's only this week recently been an agreement made about that. So I would hope that we can maintain some level of political stability, because I think history shows that when politics is unstable in the DRC, it's never a good thing for the east of the country and for civilian populations who these armed groups prey upon. And there's still many of them out there in the jungle and in the rural areas in the eastern DRC.
When I was looking at your website, I noticed the Kigali Principles on the Protection of Civilians. Didn't have a chance to check into it. What exactly is that set of principles?
Sure, and in some ways this goes back to something we were discussing earlier, which is, the Kigali Principles are really about trying to make peacekeeping more focused on upholding human rights and protecting civilians in these armed conflict situations, particularly where people are preying on civilian populations. And it's to say that, once you put peacekeepers in the field, above everything else, their responsibility, regardless of what their mandate is to protect people if armed groups or state forces are trying to commit atrocities against them. So it's a way of states that are troop contributing countries saying these are the principles that we believe in and that we will abide by when we send our people into the field. So I think it's a very positive development, and some major troop contributing countries have signed up, and it's certainly something I think every government in the world who wants to contribute to UN peacekeeping should sign up to.
Now, you're an expert on these issues. You've dealt with the many peacekeepers, you've dealt with peacekeeping missions, the International Criminal Court, with the Security Council. Do you have general recommendations for any or all of them as to what they might do to help streamline their operation, to become more effective, to be more efficient as far as really carrying out their missions? Now, with the Security Council, a lot of that's political, I realize that, but are there any recommendations, general recommendations that your NGO, as a non-governmental organization, is making, or that others are recommending to the UN or to the International Criminal Court, which is now not part of the UN, but set up by the UN?
God, I think we'd need probably about another hour and a half, maybe for me
talk to the camera crew.
to
We'll
answer to that.
that.
If everyone's happy to stay for another hour and a half, and if people are happy to keep watching, maybe we can get into that. But certainly, we made recommendations to the review on peacekeeping operations, which happened in 2015, and we've made various recommendations around these issues, and we're big supporters of the Kigali principles, as I mentioned. I should also say that, you know, I've worked in a number of those locations as well, you know, whether it be in East Timor, where there were peacekeeping operations, and I've also seen what failure looks like in somewhere like Rwanda. I visited Rwanda many times after the genocide. So certainly I think something that we always have to do in all of this, and I think this is super important for the UN, is the 38th floor can be very high and far removed from the ground.
The Secretary General's floor in New York at the UN, right?
And I think that's true of the UN. The UN can sometimes be a bubble, and New York and Geneva operate in their own kind of world. And, you know, I'm part of that world, but I'm also, you know, I continually try to remind myself of those people in the field who these are not sort of abstract questions, but these are questions of life and death for people who are facing the threat of the machete or the mass grave or the death squad's knock at the door at night. And I think we should all be very focused on that when we discuss peacekeeping, when we discuss the responsibility to protect and what human rights up front means in a 21st century UN.
I'm glad you mentioned Timor-Leste, East Timor. That, in the last 2 minutes that we have, can you talk briefly about the success of that? That was one of the most successful UN missions that gets very little publicity, maybe in textbooks or something like that, but it really went well. There was one stumble where the UN pulled out a little too early because the locals wanted them out and then they had to come back, but that was really a very successful operation, was it not? Of UN peacekeeping, of UN administration, of an area to help build up the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it is a success story for the UN, and I don't know that the lessons of East Timor have necessarily been learnt in the way that they should have at the UN, and I think we see that in other situations in the world today. I think something that the UN did right in East Timor was to recognize that there was no tradition really of independent governance that had been snuffed out by the Indonesians when they came in to East Timor. And that they really had to help the state make a transition to governance of itself and to democracy and to deal with the atrocities that had happened and to deal with the legacy of the past. I would love to see that kind of full-bodied attempt to deal with the situation be the modus operandi of the UN when it looks at places like Central African Republic or other places in the world which in some ways face some similar issues.
Mm-hmm. And the final question is, why do you think it's important for all of us to learn more about what you're doing with your center, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, what the UN's doing, and to be involved whenever we could?
That's a good question. I mean, because of my job, and it's an unusual job, you know, I visit places where horrible things have happened in the world. I stand in front of those mass graves from time to time, and I go to those memorials where people shuffle past and say never again. And I certainly think, you know, we may have learned some of the lessons from history, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us, regardless of whether you're American or a hybrid person like me from Australia and Ireland and elsewhere, or wherever you're from, to make sure that we live in a world in which we recognize the responsibility that we have to one another as human beings, because I think these crimes not only diminish our common humanity in a numeric sense, they diminish all of us in a broader spiritual sense. So I think it's time for us once and for all to make these sorts of crimes a thing of the past.
It certainly is, and many people actually remember the Holocaust. Many people lived through the Holocaust, but we've all read about it, we've seen movies about it, and we see some of the similar events taking place today, not quite to the degree of 6 million people being gassed in the ovens, but still events that 10, 20 years from now we're going to look back and say, why and how did we allow that to happen? It should never have happened. And the United Nations in 2005, when they came up with the responsibility to protect concept, really, it was a landmark decision, and now Absolutely. It's up to the countries of the world, especially the Security Council, to always move forward on this. But we all have a responsibility to learn more about this, and we can do it by going to globalr2p.org, your website. You can go to un.org and learn more about these particular issues, or people could just Google. They can go to the International Criminal Court, or they can Google the Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of Congo or UN peacekeeping, whatever the case might be, to learn more about this. But Dr. Adams, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
It's been great. Thank you very much.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.